And then there are things like implied. Am I stuck? Am I going to move forward? Oh, let's see here. Yep, my PowerPoint is stuck. Well, we're just going to have to do that. Not responding. That's okay. I'll bring it back to life. Makes the review go a little slower, doesn't it? It's reopening it. This is a big PowerPoint, so it probably is pooping its pants on occasion. We'll try and get through this a little faster. Where is she at? Oh, 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 oh. La la la. Okay. So this gal, implied shape, talking about her gown, but more important about this thing is figure ground relationship. Now, what does that have to do with shape? Shape is whatever the object is that you've created. You know, you can have a blank whatever, or just a tinted canvas or something like that. But once you start putting a subject matter of any kind into it, abstract, realistic, whatever, now you've created a foreground and a background, whether you like it or not. There's no real way around it. So the figure ground relationship is how shallow or how deep does that piece of work feel, especially when you're talking about two-dimensional art. Actually, the figure ground relationship only deals with two-dimensional work. So this one could feel very deep. It could be like she's in front of a big, deep, dark sky out on a balcony, or she's standing 6 inches away from a dark curtain. Okay? So again, like with M.C. Escher, the figure ground relationship, which Pegasi are the foreground, which one are the background. And then with figure ground relationship, when we got into the modern era of cubism, that kind of weaving in and out between the foreground and the background, and kind of almost sewing them together as if they're breaking back and forth with each other. Again, very shallow figure ground relationship, a very deep figure ground relationship. The attempt to make depth with shape and overlapping and things like that, but still feeling pretty flat and very shallow. And then by the 1950s, 40s, this dealing with the picture plane is the foreground, the background is the foreground, objects don't matter anymore, what have you. Okay, so next we're on to light and value. Actual light obviously deals with sculpture, real objects out in the world, and illusionary light is light created through the use of light and dark and color and things like that. So, all right, light to dark, light to dark. Okay? So, function of light. The description of objects. This is the most basic function of light. You shine a light on something, and you can see its dimensionality. Depending on which way you shine the light is which way the shadows fall. Light can be used not only to define objects, but to create expression and set a mood. Two very different lighting techniques for two very different men. Another function of light is to simply be decorative. These cast no shadows, they're just light colors. So there are lights and darks on this painting, but nothing is casting a shadow. So it is not showing you a light source, it's just light and dark for decoration. This is a combination of the two. There is some light showing shadow under the jawline, the nose, the eye sockets, under the breast, under the forearm. But then the brightest light on here, this gold leaf, it's casting no shadows. It's just there for decoration. Okay? Then when you have a three-dimensional object, dealing with this in this case, flat masses, frontal light, how you light a three-dimensional object, or even how you decide to light a two-dimensional painting or drawing, it all affects the expression and the mood. So light direction, light sources, very important. And then sometimes artists use light itself to make art with. Now obviously in this case they're using the trash and its assemblage to cast this shadow of the couple. And then using light passing through objects to create a two-dimensional image. Color. Alright, so the color wheel, very important. Hue, color, chroma, same thing. Right? So anytime you see the word hue, it means color. Every time you see the word color, it means color. Every time you see the word chroma, it means color. You have your three primaries, yellow, red, and blue, that cannot be mixed to be made. You have your secondaries, where those are a mixture of two primaries. So yellow and blue, blue and red, or red and yellow together. And then the tertiary colors, remember, is a primary color mixed with a secondary color. So a primary of red mixed with a secondary of, let's see, which one should we do? Yes, a primary of red mixed with a secondary of orange gives you red-orange. Okay? Now, when we talk about the value of color, like when we're doing grayscale, we say light to dark, black to white, gray. When we talk about color, we talk about tints and shades. A dark green is a shade of green. A light green is a tint of green. And then you have intensity, saturation. I misspoke earlier. Well, it's been a long few weeks. Chroma means intensity, saturation, or purity. So, right out of a tube, if a color says I'm red and you pour it out of the tube, that should be its most pure form. The second you introduce anything, a yellow, a white, a black, whatever, you have knocked back its purity, its intensity, its saturation, or its chroma. So the purer the pigment is, or color is, that means there's nothing but that pigment. So if you made a red-orange, it should be 50% red, 50% orange. The second there's more orange than red, then all of a sudden you're kind of fluctuating on the intensity or the saturation. Now, color schemes or color harmonies, we talked about these quickly. These are the basic choices that all artists kind of pick from. Now, they don't have to be a complete slave to it. It doesn't have to be all one or all the other. But it's a good beginning. So your first choice is your monochromatic. Mono meaning one, chromatic meaning color. So one color plus all of its tints and all of its shades, from black to white, and then every color in between of that one color. Every tint and shade. Then you have complementary color schemes, which complementary colors sit right across each other on the color wheel. That's why the color wheel has to be always labeled in a certain order. Otherwise, it doesn't work. If you ever label a color wheel out of order and then try to mix a complementary color, let's say out of blue and green, or you're putting blue and green against each other, they're not complements. So they're not going to work the same as blue versus orange. Okay, so this has all been planned out very specifically. You can't willy-nilly put colors on a color wheel. The next one is an analogous color wheel, which is basically all the colors that are beside each other. So if I was to say I want to do a, whoops, if I wanted to do a color scheme between blue and yellow, then I would want to use all these colors between the two to make it more harmonious. Okay? You have the triadic color scheme, which is any three colors that forms an equilateral triangle on the color wheel. So obviously the three primaries form a triadic, the three secondaries form a triadic, and then you start getting into some weird combinations. And then finally you have color discord or arbitrary color. And like I said in class, this takes a little bit more practice, and you kind of have to know what percentage of each one to use. You'll notice it's mostly reds, yellows, oranges, and then he puts in little bits of green and a little bit of blue, a little bit of green to kind of accent it. But it's all over the place. But it's all about percentages. How much of each color do you use? This is again arbitrary color. The optical effects of colors. Color changes according to surrounding colors. All four of those purple boxes are the same color, but of course the one against the dark blue looks much lighter. The Bezold effect, using complementary colors of red and green, used to vibrate the eyes. Optical illusions like this one. I don't blame you if you fast forward to this part of the video. And then you have things called simultaneous contrast, where the two greens on this slide are exactly the same color. However, when you put the one green next to a red field, it suddenly pushes it darker. It's shoving it darker because your eyes are forcing it that way to tone down the vibration. Types and functions of color. You have your local color, which is your natural color, the way you see the world every day, no matter what that is. You have optical color, which is used to create emotion or mood. Creating a mood, making sadness using optical color. Obviously, this man wasn't really that blue. If he was quite dead. But we can also see its use in using optical color in cinema, where color is a very important role to play with the mood and the effect that they're looking for in a film. The one on the top, this is from the same movie. You can see the drastic change in color scheme between the two. The past depicted in very warm oranges, yellows, golds. The present, or when this movie was made, the present, not only shown in a different season, but even the color filter, everything's very blue. The skin's blue. Everything's very washed out and cold. Again, optical color being used when you place colors side by side to create new colors. You're not actually mixing it on a palette. The receding and advancing of color. You'll notice in this piece here how rich and pure these oranges and yellows and golds and greens and dark browns are. But as we go farther and farther in the distance, the color becomes softer, mixed down, tinted more with white, more white, more white. Not pure, not harsh, just very faint. We also have the contrast between cool colors receding in the background and these very rich, warm, sunshiny colors. Although the artist shows that the sun is hitting these hills too, but they're farther away, so the light is diffused. Arbitrary color, again, when you're dealing with abstraction or expressionism, In this case, it is definitely a focal point of the piece, almost a contrast between the two different Mrs. Matisses. All right. The expression in the of Van Gogh's Night Cafe, or even just the emotional qualities of what it looks like in the winter under a full moon. And then, of course, color is deeply used in symbolism. Religions, cultures, politics. And finally, the psychology of color, how color is used to manipulate our minds and our feelings. And here is the slide. Again, this PowerPoint is on Moodle. The psychology of color kind of goes over some things. Okay. The next element we talked about was called texture. Actual texture is something you can feel with your hands, with your sense of touch. Yes, I have the window open. Sorry for that. Painting with impasto. Some artists who work two-dimensionally paint extra thick to give actual texture to a two-dimensional piece. Impasto refers to painting something very thickly, like this beginning of this painting of this face, this eye. Close-up lower view of one of Jackson Pollock's drip paintings, so you can see how thick that he actually did paint. It's a lot of paint. Actual textures, changing the bark of a tree to yarn bombing, so changing not only the color but the expected texture of tree bark to another pattern, but the softer texture of yarn. Actual texture and implied texture in one thing, where the stone you can touch is very cold and hard, but yet the sculptor created the illusion that it is soft, supple flesh. So it's kind of both. Contrast and actual texture again, the very smooth, polished arm and abdomen to the roughness of the unfinished faces. And the actual texture of somebody like Giacometti, the dog, the bronze, very, very textured. But then you have the visual textures, and we went over this piece in detail when it came to the handling of all the paint, the different fabrics, dog fur, metal, wood, cloth, glass, everything, every possible different texture you can imagine in one painting. And the functions of texture to create naturalistic appearances. So the texture of leaves, the texture of tree bark, the texture of the stones. And then the farther back we get, the less definition and the less texture. Texture is often used for expressive effect, not only in sculpture, but also in painting, the rough, scratchy painting. Texture is also created from pattern, whether it be the blinds on your window or the vent that your air conditioning blows out of. Next, we're on to space. Okay, your picture plane, your illusion of depth, the shallow picture plane, a deep picture plane. And creating space is all about, are you trying to make it look realistic or not? So naturalism. And some of the earliest ways that they created the illusion of depth was, first and foremost, overlapping. Overlapping was really the first way they could figure out to make things look like they were in front of each other, like they had some depth. Whether it be ancient Greece, they knew which side of the shield to show. And they knew to show that, wow, this is a tongue twister. They knew to show that shield in front of that shield, and then that shield in front of that figure. But everything's very flat, So overlapping was your basics. All the way up in the Dark Ages. Okay? Another way to create the illusion of depth was size. So the closer we are to an object, the larger it seems to be. The farther away an object, the smaller it seems to be. So she's not a giant. She's just closer to us than that house. As is the woman in pink here. Now, there is an exception to size. We talked about this, the hierarchical scaling. Hierarchy simply means order of importance. So, the Pharaoh Tai was not a giant, he was the Pharaoh. And when you're the king, you get to be the biggest G.I. Joe in the boat. So, that's when you can tell the difference. Like, they weren't drawing giants. Another way to create the illusion of depth is placement. Our field of vision feels like things that are closer to us are toward the bottom of our field of vision, and things that are farther away are closer to the top of our field of vision. So that's how we translate our reality. However, not always the case. Who is closer to the viewer in this painting? Is it Muhammad? Is it these, sacred virgins? There's really no telling what's in front and what's behind. The tree is back there, and there is some overlapping, but there's no real discussion of depth in terms of how far away is Muhammad from this action here. Now, how do you create depth? Well, the first way is something called perspective. Those were the many ways you create depth. I apologize. The last way of creating depth is two pieces. Perspective comes in two sections. The first is atmospheric perspective, and that is the softening of everything from color to light to texture until it becomes a mush, nothing in the distance, just a horizon. That is showing that depth through air particles, so everything gets diffused out. And then the big one it took forever to understand was linear perspective, which is a mathematical, not numeric in terms of like you have to be able to add or subtract, but by using straight edges and straight lines and points, you could describe and lay out any form of depth that you wanted on a two-dimensional surface. And that's why they mean mathematical perspective. It's not necessarily a formula, it's just an approach. So, behold the king, a one-point perspective. Doesn't get more ridiculous than that. And as you'll see later in the principles, or as you've seen in the principles, it's also the king, a focal point. So in this one, this technically isn't a three-dimensional work. This is a 2.5-dimensional, what they call a relief, which means it protrudes from a flat back. It's not in the round. So it's still very much a two-dimensional piece of work with some bumps on it, basically. Another way to create depth was something called foreshortening, where, and this is really important for organic things, when they're closer to you, they get bigger, and so you have to really push this perspective away. So like in this piece here, we know Christ doesn't have little bitty tiny pointy feet, but they're way farther away than his head. His head is closer to us. His hands are closer to us even still. So again, this one, like probably in this piece, even his feet should be a little bit bigger, being closer to us. They were doing pretty good at the chest, but if we were really straight on, these feet would be mostly just toes here. And then back to perspective, linear perspective, 2 point perspective, multiple points of 2 point perspective. Okay? And then isometric perspective, where we don't recede as we get farther away from the viewer. We don't recede as we get farther away from the viewer. We stay the same thickness all the way around, but we do show thickness. Whereas 3 point perspective is for extreme, like Spider-Man comic books. So isometric perspective you'll see a lot in games like The Sims, Asian art. A lot of Japanese and Chinese use. They don't really, this top of this bridge, or this top of this wall into the castle. It's the same thickness here as it is back here. Even though, since it's getting farther away from us, it should get smaller, but it doesn't. Diagrams. Okay. So they want to show thickness and sizes, but they don't really want to show real receding depth. Whereas in 3 point perspective, it's a super exaggeration. It almost looks like these lines bend and drain into a opening in the universe. Now, some exceptions, of course, not only with ancient art, but then later with modern art, is multiple perspectives. Side view, front view, side view, front view, side view, all in one thing. Same happens here in Cubism. Multiple perspectives. Is the knife floating in the air? Is it laying on the table? Is the table laying down? Is the guitar laying on the table? Everything's kind of in motion. The table itself seems flat here, but then all of a sudden you realize that the whole tabletop goes here. Now, the use of space in sculpture. We talked about in the round sculptures versus that guy. This is not in the round. It's got a flat back. So it's more of a wall plaque. These images, however, are in the round. The use of space. Okay, closed form, open form. And then we talked about the use of space in assemblage and installation, where most installations are temporary, but you see a space and you're like, what would look good there, blah, 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 and you do it. Now, most of them are temporary, much like our melting men. But for a little while, this audience of Icemen were in this giant stadium of steps, taking in the show of us humans walking by. Okay? So that's a review of all of that craziness. Okay? So understanding the functions and all the elements is going to be a key portion of that test, along with the principles that I've already given you. So that's a wrap for this review. Feel free to email me any questions you have, any concerns you have. If you don't understand the instructions on the test, just let me know. I have a feeling that there's going to be a lot of A's this time, since there's really, sad to say, no way to keep you from cheating. So there you go. This will be split into 2 pieces. Well, actually, this might be split into 3 pieces because it's about 41 minutes long of a review. So, but that's less than a class. So hang in there, and hope you're all doing well. Bye.